view today's meeting in side-by-side mode, and you can change your view mode in the top right-hand corner of the Zoom. During the event, we will run a brief poll and you'll be automatically prompted to respond. So please do take part in that, and our speakers will notify you when polling will begin and end. So it's now my pleasure to introduce Dr Malcolm Barratt-Johnson, Managing Director of PharmaMedic, who will be moderating today's session. As a consultant pharmaceutical physician to industry and government, Malcolm has been a trusted advisor for over 25 years to a range of bioscience and pharmaceutical companies on aspects of product development, regulatory strategy and medical affairs, focusing on startups and SMEs. Thank you, Malcolm, and over to you.
Liz, thank you very much indeed. And what an intro. Thank you very much. That's lovely. Everybody, thank you very much indeed for coming this morning. Yeah, and it's quite early, but it's quite a good time because everybody seems to be up in this new sort of way of working. It's my pleasure to introduce this meeting, and we hope it's going to be one of a number going forward as well, because we really want to engender a sense of togetherness and you know, feeling that we can actually talk to each other and meet with each other in a fairly informal setting. We've got two fantastic speakers today. We've got Dr. Lucy Cook, who I'll introduce and hand over to in a moment. Lucy and I have worked together for many years. She's a very trusted colleague and friend. She's worked in a number of areas of medicine. She focuses mainly on medical affairs, in prescription medicines and other parts of medical science. The second speaker is Dr. Zubair Hussain. Zubair and I think we met Zubair, didn't we, probably over 20 years ago. And Zubair and I worked together at that point on regulatory bits and pieces. Zubair is an absolute expert in regulatory sciences. Zubair is the head of LA4D, which is a regulatory affairs group. Both our speakers are both independent. Lucy as well runs her own company called Wiltshire Pharma. And it's my pleasure, as I said, to introduce both of them and have them speaking to us this morning. It's very important, I think, in these times to look at what's going forward. We, as individuals, end up focusing very much on our day jobs, which is inevitable. But we had two major changes in the last year. The first is, of course, COVID and the ways of working with COVID. What Lucy's going to do is talk about what's going to be happening probably after COVID and look at forward and see how we can change and how we will be changing our ways. And Zubair will be talking about the regulatory science aspects post-Brexit, both incredibly important areas, and I think I've got the best speakers who could possibly talk to that. So Lucy, if I could introduce you. Oh, actually, no, we got a poll first, which will be good. So we got two polls today. The first poll, hopefully the technology will work. So Liz has done a fantastic job on sorting this out. So we've got the poll coming up. We've got two questions for you, very simple answers. But if you could just do those for us, that would be very kind. And then we can have those on screen, I hope, in a moment. So we're going to leave you for 30 seconds to feed into those. One's a rather fun one, and the other one probably a little less fun, but still of interest to us. Have you participated in Dry January? Well, it hasn't been a very dry January anyway, never mind the drinking bit. But, have we got anybody coming in, Liz? The magic, hopefully, and we should get them coming up. Wow, it works. That's fantastic. That's good. So 72% no for Dry January, 28% yes. Well, that's pretty good. And virtual congresses, well, I thought I would end up with that sort of result. 88% yes and 12% no. Right, okay. I don't think one can almost avoid virtual congresses nowadays, can you? Right, now Lucy, can I launch you, please? Thank you very much. And thank you. And oh, let's close out one. Is that under me or was it under you, Liz? Okay, great. Lucy, over to you.
Thank you very much, Malcolm. Can you all hear me? Can you hear me okay? Yeah, great, thank you. Next slide, please. Thank you for that kind introduction, Malcolm. It's my absolute pleasure to speak to you all this morning. I'm going to cover as Malcolm said, what I see as shaping up for the future post-COVID, and also as we move forward through the pandemic, some observations that I have, and hopefully that will be congruent with your experiences. But please, if there are any questions, as Liz has already said, please fire them away. Next slide, please. So let's think about how we'll continue to use the virtual technologies as we engage with customers throughout our working day. Next slide, please. So I think it's probably no surprise that we would expect to see virtual scientific congresses for the rest of this year, and probably into next year as well. But I can see that for the congresses that I've worked on across a few companies now, that this might well be an important revenue stream for them. So I would expect virtual congresses to run alongside the face-to-face meetings once we are allowed to resume them. And this will allow a wider audience participation. I think it's been much more user-friendly for those of us who have in the past struggled to make all the congresses we would wish to attend, with childcare arrangements and with other commitments that we have in our lives. And working through all these scientific congresses, it's been really helpful to have the FPA guidance. So if you haven't already visited it, I strongly encourage you to go and have a look at that. It's been disappointing that we haven't had any ABPI guidance, but hopefully we'll see some of that coming through soon. Next slide, please. So, of course, we can't get away from the fact that sales-focused meetings have had to continue virtually as well. And the use of Zoom, Teams, BlueJeans and other platforms have been well used. I think the best meeting attendance has probably been like this, early morning and early evening. And we've had great participation I've seen across a number of companies where you do seek interaction. So we're trying to put some of that into best practice this morning, trying to get some interaction and seek feedback during the meeting. And I think what I've seen work really well is putting an agenda together which addresses the healthcare professionals' needs, so that you're attracting a good attendance, and that allows a pathway forward for more focused meetings that maybe the company would like to proceed with. Oh, I think we've skipped some slides. Lovely, thank you. And so I think the individual virtual one-to-one slides will continue in preference this year because we have to, but I think it's worked tremendously well. Many clients of mine have been able to access customers that they in the past maybe they've struggled to. And with the feedback that you get, of course, adapt your meetings that you're holding. And just a word of warning that any approval of recording meetings, we need to think carefully about that. Next slide, please. So company-sponsored symposia. What I would say, remember when you're organising and arranging these, it's more than likely you'll have your competitors in attendance. So you might want to think carefully about what is presented and shared. There will need to be very careful briefings, both for internal staff and any speakers you are asking to speak on your behalf. The functionality of the chat needs to be explored and understood by anybody that is participating. It is very good practice to have somebody from medical compliance on hand to correct any off-label comments or questions. Somebody needs to interject promptly to correct anything that has been said. And as I mentioned before, the recording, I think the natural course of such a webinar might be to record the proceedings and put it straight onto a platform that can be viewed. Of course, the world that we work in, we have to consider there are many other aspects of what we do that might fall foul of the code. So consideration of that aside from any etiquette or data protection issues that we might encounter. Next slide, please. So in terms of practical points that we've encountered throughout these virtual congresses is, does the company wish to be involved in the Congress, and how far do they wish to be involved? And once you've decided that, deciding on the applicable code, and this has been the topic of conversation in a few occasions where we've encountered disagreement about which code is applicable. And my understanding is that the majority of attendees, based on past experience, is what should drive that decision. So if the UK had the majority of attendees at the previous face-to-face Congress, then that should drive the next virtual Congress applicable code. Now, as I've already mentioned, FPA have some guidance, and the explanatory notes and disclaimers are extremely helpful in guiding that approval and making sure we're on track. The attendee access to the Congress needs to be explored and understood, ideally password protected, and the booths that the company can use need to be considered as to whether they're considered promotional or non-promotional, and careful conversation around how the non-promotional booth will function separate from the promotional booth. Interaction with attendees, again, is a really important aspect. Bear in mind the fundamental aspect is if a sales-based person is writing down anything in text, it is considered that them creating their own materials, and of course that would almost certainly be a breach of the code. So company sponsored symposia, next slide please. We've already spoke about, but of course they can be part of those congresses. So moving forward, just a little thought about the materials that we're using and how we can make the most of them. Next slide please. So at the moment, of course, we are having to work digitally, and just a note that it's a bit of a trap that some of us can fall into if we're not careful, ensuring that the materials we're using have been approved for the format being used, and making sure that if we are contacting healthcare professionals, we have that contact permission and it's formally recorded. Many companies have been ahead of the game already, but many have developed during the pandemic a controlled platform, so where we can display items for an appropriate audience and appropriate version control, so that we are conveying information that to them which we would ordinarily be handing out maybe face to face. And of course then there's a consideration of the different media that are available and how they function on that digital platform, and a consideration of the patient support materials that are available, making sure they are printable and therefore portable when used. Next slide please. So I think looking to the future, digital materials we're almost certainly going to be relying more on the materials that we've created and are creating. And just a note that if we are creating extra materials to sit alongside what's already been approved, make sure they don't get overlooked, ensure they do get updated and they do get captured in their periodic review with everything else that was originally there. And just a note also about ensuring we have optimum usage. We are probably having customers use our materials on varying devices with varying levels of digital access. So it's worth just having some of our technical colleagues think about how that can be optimized and maximized to ensure that they get the best possible experience when using our materials. Next slide, please. So I also promised I'd make a short mention of clinical development, and I think it's not been unnoticed by the entire population that our regular has regulator has been exemplary in their approach to the situation that we find ourselves in, flexible, agile and thorough throughout, really maximising what we can achieve during a pandemic in a public health emergency by prioritising being pragmatic and open communication across a wide range of products, including diagnostics, vaccines, clinical trials and medicines. And of course, the use of smartphone and other digital technologies has pushed forward the ability of the clinical trials that have been achieved so quickly and efficiently, allowing us to work remotely and achieve so much in such a short space of time. So decisive, confident decisions have been able to be made. And I know that Zubair is going to touch on some of these aspects as well in his presentation. So next slide. So that's really what I wanted to say. I hope I've kept to time. I think there's going to be another short poll in the interests of employing our best practice and engaging our audience. So if you'd like to vote now, I think there should be one fun one. When do you think we will holiday abroad again? And do you understand how the UK's medical and regulatory environment will operate in post-Brexit environment? So, do we have any answers? Okay, so most people think that it's not going to be any of the above. I think there's a few of us that are maybe a bit more optimistic. I'm hoping to get to Wales in July. Fingers crossed. So I think that's it from me. Zubair, can I hand over to you?
Yeah, thank you very much, Lucy, and good morning to everyone. The regulatory environment, I think, as we all know and understand, is changing rapidly, and navigating that environment is just as important as ever. So in this presentation today, I will cover the European complex clinical trial innovation through a recent guidance that was published by the Clinical Trial Facilitation Group. I will also cover the Brexit situation and medical device clinical trial expectations that have changed according to the medical device regulation. So next slide, please. So complex clinical trials, we've had a number of examples of these more recently in the COVID area, but also they are very prevalent in oncology with orphan medicines, personalized medicines, and other advanced therapies. The key thing to understand with regards to these complex clinical trials is that really they are could be considered separate clinical trials themselves. The arms of these clinical trials could be considered separate clinical trials themselves. They address several types of questions at once regarding efficacy and safety, and they contain prospectively defined additions of IMP, investigational medicinal products, or different types of populations that can be introduced into the study, and these are prospectively defined through a master protocol. The European Clinical Trial Facilitation Group groups these types of studies into three categories: basket studies, umbrella studies, and platform studies. With regards to basket studies, usually there's one IMP or there's a set combination of IMPs, and they look at different populations. So these arms look at different populations. For example, you could have different types of cancer that could be looked at in basket studies. And in umbrella studies, there's usually several IMPs being looked at simultaneously in one population. For example, one type of cancer with different types of genetic mutations could be an umbrella study. Then you have platform studies. Here you're looking at several IMPs, probably the most complicated type of study you can have, several IMPs being looked at in multiple populations. There are examples, so many examples of this, including in the COVID space with hydroxychloroquine. The master protocol, as I've mentioned before, has to be flexible to allow for further interventions, either in the IMP space or also in the population space. So therefore, it's quite a dynamic design. And you don't need a new trial in this kind of situation in a platform trial. You don't need a new trial every time you have a new intervention. They're quite adaptive, therefore, in nature, and you're pre-specifying any new additions of IMP or populations where possible. And you, of course, you can complete substantial amendments to those clinical trial applications as well. The operational complexity of these studies usually is increasing compared to a normal clinical trial. But on the other hand, you do have operational resource efficiency in such studies. And I think that's a balance that needs to be considered when thinking about adopting a complex clinical trial design. You require quite detailed protocols, as I've mentioned, and you also need to have you will have a situation where data becomes available from different arms of the study at different times. And therefore, you have to understand the impact of that in terms of publication and what that could mean for perceptions of the clinical data. And that's been very evident in the COVID trials, where some data has become available and then other data becomes available at different times. The European Clinical Trial Facilitation Groups advises that we use the voluntary harmonization procedure for applying for the clinical trial applications for complex clinical trials. And that is a specific procedure as opposed to the national applications that you can, of course, make in individual countries across Europe. And of course, with Brexit, and I'll cover this in shortly, there is a national clinical trial application for the UK now. Next slide, please. So I think with this slide, I just really wanted to give a good understanding of how these clinical trial applications can be made. You can either make them as separate clinical trials. On the right-hand side, you see separate clinical trial applications, which are kind of linked by the trial name. And this is one approach to manage clinical trial applications for complex studies. And on the left-hand side, it's still a one submission process, where you have a master protocol, and then you have different arms within that study. And for example, the first arm could be around the standard of care, and then you could try another IMP in the second arm and another IMP in the third arm, et cetera, et cetera. So this is an example of one trial with one application. And both these approaches are acceptable. But I think the key message here is that scientific advice, regulatory agency advice is really critical, whether you seek that on a national basis or whether you seek that through the Scientific Advice Working Party in Europe. It's really important that you have a good understanding of what things that you should consider when developing such a complex clinical trial. There's also in the UK, for example, an innovation office, which are more than ready to engage with sponsors who want to conduct complex clinical studies, giving advice appropriately. Next slide, please. So in terms of recommendations for complex clinical trials, the initial phase, the trial planning and design, I've already mentioned. Really important to get input from investigators, regulators, and that should happen at very early stages when considering what type of study to do and understanding the IMP and understanding the population. It's really important, of course, to work carefully on the protocol development, and there may be future modifications that you need to consider when developing the protocol. It's really, really important that you reduce the number of substantial amendments in the future, because of course that can take time whilst the clinical trial is ongoing. You have patient-facing documentation that needs to be considered, and I think that's already been covered to some aspect, to some degree, by Lucy. But for example, you need invitation documents, you need study arm-specific documents, and you need a handbook. And of course, multimedia is considered acceptable these days, so there are different combinations of things that can be developed for patient-facing material, and this is another specialist area. Statistical considerations are really critical. Different types of analysis need to be performed. These need to be prospectively defined. You need to set any non-inferiority margins or superiority superiority designs and the hypotheses that need to be developed. And these things all have to be prospectively defined. So really important to get a good statistician on board. And of course, you have the dissemination of the results at the end. And you can have trial data come out at different times. And it's important to understand that and the impact of that for the IMPs involved in the clinical study or for the population. And we see many examples of that in the current environment. Next slide, please. So I think now move on to Brexit and what that means. I think it's already been alluded to that the UK MHRA has always played a very prominent role in European legislation development in terms of assessment of new medicines, whether they be biologics. They have a very active medical device group as well, all within the MHRA. So I think they really want to flex their muscles and demonstrate how quickly they can innovate, how quickly they can approve clinical trials, and how quickly they can approve new medicines. And we begin to see that in the environment more recently with the approval of the vaccines. I think there is a new medicines and devices bill that is planned. It's been approved by the House of Commons and also by the House of Lords. It's now waiting for royal assent, so that should come through very soon. But essentially, some of the things that it kind of introduces are things that have been developed either by MHRA as part of Europe in the past, or what exactly is in place in Europe right now. Some of the things I've mentioned here on the slide are things like a track and trace system, very similar to the one developed in Europe. The early access to cutting technology, IMPs, investigational medicinal products or new medicines is really a key part of what the UK MHRA want to be involved in. They're very interested in complex clinical trials and see themselves at the forefront of those. They want to streamline the procedures where possible in terms of approval timelines for clinical trial applications and also for approval of marketing authorization applications, which I'll cover in a minute, where they have many different pathways that you can go down in terms of getting the approvals for either clinical trials, but also for MAA applications. There are digital platforms that are being introduced so that companies can update their own information on their products. There are faster national procedures, and also from 1st of January 2021 for medical devices, they've developed a new system whereby all devices have to be registered. They also, of course, as a result of doing clinical studies, for example, you must always have a responsible person in Europe. If you're a company or a sponsor outside of Europe, that now also is applicable for UK, where you need to have a responsible person in the UK if you are a sponsor, for example, in Europe or the US. So that also has been mirrored by the UK. Next slide, please. So some of the interesting developments with regards to the new pathways that have been developed. You have this innovative licensing and access procedure. This is really for early products that, for example, compassionate use. That it's really important that the UK has access to these medicines, and they've developed a specific procedure to accelerate the time to market and facilitate patient access to these innovative medicines. They have a national marketing authorization application procedure, which is a 150-day procedure compared to the 210-day procedure in Europe. So really, they are trying to cut in terms of the timelines, and we've seen examples of that very recently. There's also a rolling review. Essentially, that means that you can file applications in modules. And again, we saw that with the vaccines, that they'd filed different packets of data early on, and eventually that meant a faster approval with a rolling review procedure. There's also an EC decision reliance procedure. Essentially, what that means is that if a product has been approved through the European procedures, decentralized or centralized or mutual recognition, that in fact you can have a 67-day procedure to allow for recognition of that medicine in the UK. And that's also being put into the new bill. You have this unfettered access from Northern Ireland. That's also another 67-day procedure in case there are medicines available in Northern Ireland that could be approved in the UK. And then there are these access consortium partnerships, I would call them, with different regulatory agencies around the world. And for example, in the Access Consortium, you have the UK, you have the Australian agency, Canada, Singapore, and Switzerland, who all come together, and you can file a kind of simultaneous application, albeit they're still national applications, but still simultaneously you can file in these countries. And this is a new procedure that will be available to sponsors. Then there's this Project Orbis, again for international procedures. This is coordinated by the FDA and involves countries like the ones I've just mentioned, Australia, Canada, UK, of course, Singapore, but also countries like Brazil. So it introduces a broader scope of countries which you can begin to access through a faster route. And of course, UK being now independent from Europe wants to participate in many of these early access or early MAA application procedures as possible. I think that's kind of, next slide, please. Sorry, yeah, I think I have a summary I don't have a summary of the Brexit, but I think that's kind of the key points that I wanted to raise. I can move on now to the medical device regulation. So the medical device regulation has been in place now for at least a year or so. It requires significant new clinical trials for devices that are implantable, for example. Depending on the classification of the device, we know it's a risk-based approach. But for those devices that are higher risk, usually clinical data is required depending upon the type of device that it is. And those requirements are changing significantly compared to the medical device directive that used to be in place. There is also a new ISO standard in helping to determine how clinical trials should be run. That's called the ISO 14155. That's recently been published and is a key standard that needs to be followed. It kind of mirrors the guidance on clinical trials for pharmaceuticals, but still it has to be respected, and there are some nuances specific for medical devices. You also need, as a result of the medical device regulation now, post-market clinical trial follow-up. As part of the post-market surveillance activities, there's a lot of emphasis on periodic safety update reports, which have been in place for pharmaceuticals now for some time, but have now also been introduced for medical devices. Then you have scientific advice on clinical trials. Unfortunately, they don't have a similar kind of process, very well developed type of process as they do with pharmaceuticals in the medical device arena. So actually, there's a lot more emphasis on trying to develop clinical trials that are risk-based approach, but more or less upon what the sponsor feels is the right approach to take. So there's very little advice that you can gain on clinical trials with regards to medical devices. So that puts a lot more emphasis on the sponsor to try and navigate and understand what to include in the clinical study in terms of endpoints, in terms of different aspects of statistical analysis, secondary endpoints, and such like. You still need to have now a person responsible for regulatory compliance. And this is a significant role now in the medical device regulation, whereby the technical file and documentation associated with the technical file has to be approved by a person responsible for regulatory compliance. And this is a legal responsibility with, fines and jail sentences, as you would normally expect in some of the European legislation. I've mentioned the periodic safety update reports. It is a new requirement, but post-market surveillance is a significant new requirement as part of the medical device regulation. So next slide, please. The key giveaways then, or summary of the presentation. There is a recommendation paper now from the clinical trial facilitation groups on complex clinical trials, and that helps sponsors innovate different types of clinical trial designs. There's a lot of change with regards to Brexit and also the global pandemic, but that might be intimidating. However, it does open new doors for innovation in the industry. And there are significant changes in the medical device arena with regards to clinical evidence required to support medical devices in the future. And I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. So guys, thank you. So Lucy, thank you very much indeed for your overview. Fantastic. And Zubair, thank you. You've taken us a whiz through both the regulatory side and wider saying things like devices as well. We've got quite a few questions come in actually, which is great. So if I can start with you then, Lucy, but please, open up and please feedback as we're discussing, because I think both these areas are incredibly important. We haven't worked in this sort of environment before. There's a lot of challenges open to us, and I've seen a lot of stuff which is going on which I haven't seen before either. Lucy, a couple of things. Mike was asked about location. I think you mentioned about code and location, and the way when you set up virtual congresses and meetings, there is obviously a different view of looking at things and the way that you take forward those congresses and sign them off. Michael and indeed Assad were both commenting and asking about, is the location of the company important? So say you're GSK or say you're AstraZeneca sitting in the UK, would it not be the UK code that applies to it?
So I think I've had that conversation with a number of clients as to what code do we apply, and I think before we were all up to speed with the FPA guidance, we did consider where the company was based. But my interpretation of the FPA guidance is that we should be considering previous Congress attendance as a guide to the applicable code. So that's what we've used since then. So I hope that's still the case.
I think it's an interesting one. I think, what I have seen is some cases a bit of a ramshackle approach to this, where companies have sort of said, well, most of our attendees are from England, so that's fine, we'll go with the UK code. Or we're sort of got a European group going on, so we're doing a bit of a mishmash. We're doing sort of a trans-European code, which we probably do need, actually. We almost need a trans-global code over and above what we've got, because we've got national codes, we've got FPA codes, which generally speaking work across all the European arena. And indeed the IFMA code, which I think it was revised in 2012, and that's actually pretty good across all the countries in the world. But there's obviously big differences. It does raise issues.
It does, yes. And I think, we do need to think carefully about the company involvement and what exactly they are displaying, because of course when you're working across affiliates and with your global operations, they'll have significantly different ideas as to what code requirements are needed.
Yes. One thing I've seen, I don't know if anybody else has seen this, is the use of LinkedIn, because social media has obviously become a lot more important than we thought it would do. And so I've seen people sort of using things like LinkedIn, which I thought you would not be able to use. But actually it's interesting. There seems to be a push now to use things like social media on a much wider setting. The push for LinkedIn is the fact that when you sign up for LinkedIn, you're actually giving permission for people to contact you, surprisingly, and that includes medics, if you target it very correctly and very specifically. I don't know if that's something other people have seen, but the use of social media in a wider context and the way we use that is something which I think we're going to really have to develop it bit more. And I don't know about you, Lucy, or anybody else, but I don't think really our friends at the PMCP have really caught up with this yet. It's caught them a bit on the hop, really.
Yes, I think it would be nice if we could have more guidance in this area. It's been some time since the industry as a whole has been given guidance. And yes, the world has moved on massively since the last round of guidance. So yes, it would be encouraging to make sure we're all on the same page and we've all understood the requirements correctly.
I don't know if anybody else wanted to chip in, but I think, has anybody else seen the use of LinkedIn or other social media forms? I think it's been a huge bonus in some respects to see the way that people have been trying to be innovative and trying to push the boundaries, but we do have to be very careful.
This is Teresa. I've seen this already for years now. Even, not just, you mentioned LinkedIn, but some people also use Twitter. Actually, they use Twitter even more.
Yes.
And I mean, just so that it has been some situation where individuals have posted, but I think what is important is not that much the type of platform, is the intention with which, you know, people post and to what audience. So I think in reality, even if it is mentioned specifically or is not, I think it's covered by the code anyway.
Yes, no, Teresa, hi. Yes, it's very true. I think that's what I say. I say it depends on your intention going forward as to what you intended to do with this information.
Yes, so what I'm trying to say is that there's no point in listing all or in, you know, looking at all the possible platforms, because there will be more, if anything.
Yes.
But what matters is, you know, what happens is and the action and the intention. So
Yes, no, you're
I'm
absolutely.
not so sure whether we want to have, you know, all the possible cases or all the possible media under the sun or the moon, but it's I think it's a matter of
Yes,
common sense. And so it becomes, you know, if it becomes advertising to the public, or it becomes a promotion, or it becomes, you know, I think at the end of the day, it's not a matter of.
I agree, Teresa. I think what underpins the requirements of the codes is pretty clear, and we can use that. I think there are some very specific scenarios where it's been tricky to navigate to do the right thing and apply the code. And I think as we work through the various different situations, it it will be helpful to pass that on to the authorities and say, look, you know, how best can we navigate this, and what's best practice. And
I think there is one thing that was mentioned here at the beginning of this discussion, which actually I believe is very relevant, and that is the legal aspect. Because as you mentioned before, for example, LinkedIn, you have to give permission to people. Once that you agree to use LinkedIn, you automatically give permission to people to contact you. But again, I think it's important why they contact you and what is the intention. If that is to promote something, or to, you know, then that permission might not be sufficient, you know, because you give permission to contact you, but not, you know, how broad that can be. So
yeah, it's an interesting one, Teresa. What I have seen is that something that I don't think companies have really taken on board is something called geolocation. So things like LinkedIn and social media, you can very specifically target not only the individuals, but where those information bits will go to.
yeah.
So we had a case where actually there was a complaint, and they said, well, you know, this has been seen in the UK, it's been seen in other countries. What they showed that actually was geolocated to the eastern seaboard of the United States. It was at Pacific. What had happened is that it had spread outside of that. And then we could show that actually there's only one person in the UK who actually responded to that social comment. It's very difficult, but I think all this stuff is way beyond my ability. But you can do geolocation and geofencing with things like LinkedIn and social media. I think, you know, Sarah, you popped up there that you've seen HCPs on short video clips as well. I think it's a very tricky one when you start seeing HCPs on video clips on things like LinkedIn, because then you do see it is got a tendency to sort of filter out and go to the general public. A couple of questions for you, Zubair. A lot of interest on the regulatory side. One of them is, could you comment on this is Richard, he said, can you comment on the changing product licenses now in the UK? So we've seen the introduction now of the GB stickers effectively on our medicines, haven't we? So we're getting a bit like a little bit sort of nationalistic and sticking these things on the back of our cars. We're going to start sticking them on the back of our licenses now and our products. Are there any issues that have come up about the GB things? We've seen a lot of companies, some have taken early access and they're starting to stick these on now. Could you sort of clarify for us when they go on and why?
Absolutely. I mean, as we become less and less aligned with European legislation over time, clearly, you know, things are going to change. And one of the things that, you know, will of course change is product license numbers. The EMA has a specific way in which it determines those license numbers, and of course they appear on the packaging of medicines, you know, throughout, and also on inserts as well. So at the moment, if there, I think the key thing to mention is that the MHRA are relatively pragmatic, and you should discuss with them your specific requirements. But of course, there will be longer term a requirement to have a GB product license number. I think you have to accept that it's legally now the situation, and that is going to be in the medicines bill as well. The question is, at what stage do you adopt that? And the pragmatic nature of that discussion needs to happen between the sponsor and the MHRA, depending on when the product was approved and what preparations have been made or not, and depending on, of course, on there's a supply chain involved and their lead times, etc., etc. So I think understanding exactly all those different aspects and then having a negotiation with the MHRA as to exactly when you can do that, I think is the most pragmatic way. Of course, it's a legal requirement from 1st of January to have that. And then there's the pragmatic nature of when you could introduce it.
I was under the impression one of the conditions was that if you have a variation, that automatically triggers the need for GB stickers, effectively, or GB licensing. Yeah. So I've seen lots of early adopters.
Yes, and that's also because of the fact that you're actually planning a change, and at that point, of course, when you're planning a change, then they make the assumption that you can also plan for the product license number change.
That's interesting, but that is for the future. What will happen for the product that had already a license? Will they have to have also a GB product license number?
Absolutely, yeah,
yes.
Absolutely, because
but they haven't. Yeah, but they have. They haven't announced how this will be rolled out.
I think this is part of many things that have not been announced and have not been clearly specified, because very few guidances are available as a result of the departure in Brexit, and particularly with regards to medicines legislation. The medicines bill will really help, but it's very legal in the way it's written. So I think there will be a lot more guidance coming from MHRA with regards to how to handle things like this.
So watch this space, basically.
Exactly, will be it will be new guidance coming, of course.
Thank you.
Because Liz is asking about Northern Ireland. So my understanding, Zubair, is that Northern Ireland, surprisingly and confusingly, sticks with the European license. So we've got now on product licenses on PIs, we've now got your Northern Ireland retains the EU, and you've got to state the Northern Ireland EU. If you've got Ireland separate, you've got Ireland's license together with no reference to the pricing, and then you've got the UK license, which is different again. So you may, if you're working across Ireland and the UK, end up possibly with 3 licenses. You could end up with an Irish EU license with no things on it, but maybe a separate one, and then a Northern Ireland one and an UK one. So it is all a bit confusing.
Yes, and let's not forget about the fact that there could be potentially 5, right, with Scotland and Wales coming in the future. So it could be a very interesting environment for the UK.
I know, it's amazing, isn't it? I'm waiting for Scotland. I'm going to move up there. The other one is about PSURs and the differences for medical products and devices. So the PSURs, so we know about, well, DSURs, I suppose, for medical products as such. Devices is a new area, isn't it? The whole device thing is a bit of a minefield to some extent. You're commenting on it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the periodic safety update reports for marketing authorization applications have kind of been in place now for quite some time. Again, after a CE mark has been approved in Europe, or now a specific GB mark will be approved in the UK in future, there will still be an expectation to produce something very similar. There is guidance in the medical device regulation with regards to exactly what type of information to include, but it's the usual type of information on adverse events, serious adverse events, or post-market surveillance data that has become available, marketing data with regards to, how easily accessed, or if you like, how the product has penetrated the market. And I think all of those things will need to be included in periodic safety update reports. There's a separate requirement, of course, with regards to annual safety reports when it comes to medical device clinical trial approvals, and also with regards to medicinal product clinical trial approvals, where it's then called a DSUR. So, but those are two different things. The DSUR and the annual safety reports are associated with clinical trials, and the periodic safety update reports are really associated with products already approved in the marketplace and where you're doing post-market surveillance.
Zahid, thank you. One thing you touched on, which I'm getting quite a lot into now, is, as you said, ILAP, this innovative licensing procedure, which the UK introduced on the 1st of January. That's produced a huge, I've seen anyway, I'm sure you may well have seen it, and everybody else has probably seen it, a huge rush for the application of that to a range of products. As everybody might know, when you can apply for an ILAP, and you apply basically for a passport. So effectively what ILAB is, and Zubair, please correct me, it's effectively an ability for the MHRA in the UK to work with the NIHR and indeed with NICE. And NICE, I understand it, actually signed a deal with the MHRA about 2.5 weeks ago, saying that NICE would work hand in hand to some extent with MHRA for a development process. So if you put the ILAP passport in, this passport application, and take it through to ILAP, effectively NICE, NIHR, NHSE, so the NHS executive, and the MHRA will work with you for your clinical development pathway. Why are they being so nice to us, Zubair? Are they just trying to curry up favour and get all the stuff into the UK, knowing we're going to be country number 27, or is there another more a more sinister move for this? It sounds almost too good to be true.
I think the debate on clinical trials and supporting innovation has been quite rife for many years, and as we know and well understand, that a lot of the clinical trials went outside of Europe, including outside of the UK, to some other countries like in Latin America or in Asia, and of course it was felt as if these clinical studies and innovation was happening in other markets around the world, and of course Europe wanted to continue to maintain more and more clinical studies within Europe. And I think UK, being a leading member of Europe, now going through this Brexit activity, really recognizes the fact that this is where real innovation is performed, and they want to be part of that innovation. So having an early access scheme, which is easily accessible, involves the right parties, and cuts the bureaucracy as far as possible, which I know MHRA are really keen on for many years, is really attractive to them, because again, they want to be seen as a leading authority when it comes to innovation, whether it be in the clinical trial field or whether it's in a legislative change, which I'm sure will happen over time, which separates and takes us away from legislation as it stands today in Europe. So I think it's really all part of the kind of beyond number one philosophy that I think MHRA seem to have, which is that they want to be on the leading edge.
And Teresa's asking where we can find information about this. I think, Teresa, it's on the government website. I'll send you the link, but it is on the government website. You've got the 3 areas by which ILAP or passport application can be made. So it's fairly well set out on that. The other thing actually on that side is about Project Orbis as well, because Project Orbis is basically this is allowing us to work with the FDA and some other regulators to fast track the regulatory process across a global number of international co-regulators. And it's a very cunning plan, actually, which I'm not quite sure if the MHRA knew just what they were going to be doing with this towards the end of 2020, but it's almost too well set out, actually. It was a very, basically, you put in place this innovation development system, then a heightened ability to work with other regulators outside the European Union. It was almost too cunning, actually. Do you think they thought about that as a package, Zubair, or do you think it's something that just happened to be at the same time?
I think, first of all, I think it's really for innovative medicines, and I think they started to discuss the approved promising cancer treatments. So I think it's a conscious decision by the UK to be involved in this project, because they can see the benefits. And again, they're trying to reach out to and understand what is in the landscape with regards to approving new medicines or innovative medicines and how they can be involved. So I think it's certainly a deliberate move. and one that kind of is there. And I think they've been thinking about this for some time, because the Brexit debate has been happening for the last 3 years. So they've been thinking, well, what happens when we're not part of Europe? What do we, which other countries do we want to be associated with, and potentially what other process and procedures can we participate in that will keep us as a leading health authority globally. That's
very clever. Zubair, thank you. We've only got a few more minutes to go. We've got about 3. Lucy, I'd just like to come back to you before I sort of close. What's your view as a way that some companies are now they're now beginning to ramp up their they feel that they can go back out and start talking to clients, HCPs, for better or worse. How do you see the field teams being utilised now going forward? Because obviously I think we've almost got the MSL teams now being a more powerful voice. We've seen what the MSL teams can do, and we've seen basically marketing teams, as great as they are together with field teams, having a lesser role during certainly the first part of the year. Do you think the field teams will be adapted or changed in some way?
It's a good question, and I think it's something that I've seen dealt with in various different ways. Unfortunately, and I think almost inevitably, some teams were streamlined at the start of the pandemic. I think there has been a rethink of how the sales team is engaged, and inevitably, and setting up meetings. I think they've also internally tried to work on projects which give a value add to customers and therefore patients, so that their time and their efforts are put to good use until such time as we are able to be more face to face. And I also think that the virtual interactions have still been meaningful, and also I think customers are still wanting to keep on top of new products coming through, new data coming through, the value add offerings that companies are producing to make their portfolio more appealing. And so yeah, I think it's a range of measures just to maximise what a company can offer both to the healthcare professional and the patient.
Okay, Lucy, thank you. Guys, the hour went very quickly. My thanks again for all of you to attend, because it's been very valuable to have this. This is our first kickoff meeting. What we'd like to do is develop this further and have one of these probably every couple of months if you think that's a great idea. Please feed back to us. We've got an email called hello@pharmamedic.co.co. So if you'd like to leave us your thoughts about that, great. If you any more thoughts, please pop them down into the chat box down there. Any more questions, please also send those in, and we'll give them to our 2 resident experts. Lucy, Zahid, you didn't know that was coming, did you? But hopefully there won't be too many for you. And my thanks again to you, Lucy. Thank you ever so much for spending time and effort putting it into, and also to you, Zubair, because of your fantastic presentations and for spending the time. It's a lot of work behind the scenes. And of course to my team, so Anna, Lisa, Liz, thank you. They've been working very hard behind the scenes. Even getting something like this working, it needs a bit of IT, and I'm no good at the IT bit, as a lot of you guys may know. So thank you very much, and thank you for your thanks, because you got those coming up into the chat box too. So great. Hopefully it's a useful initiative. What I would like later in the year, if we can and we're allowed out, is to do this in real time. I'd love to do it so that we can actually host something correctly, either a breakfast meeting or an evening meeting. Maybe we even be able to go to a restaurant at some point. That'd be fun, won't it?
Wouldn't that be something?
Okay.
Yeah.
That'd be lovely.
You never know. You never know. All right, guys. Thank you, and thank you again.
Malcolm.
Thank you.
Thank you for hosting.